Hello, welcome to Learn It Yourself. Today's class is about verbs. We are going to split this class on verbs into many parts so that it can be understood better. In today's session, we'll be discussing about the verb patterns, verb types, and auxiliary verbs. So let's begin our class on verbs part 1.
What do we play?
Play is a regular verb. Do is an irregular verb and primary auxiliary verb.
I will teach a game.
Teach, will are irregular verbs.
Draw a few squares on the ground.
Draw is an irregular verb.
Write numbers in the squares. Find a stone for me.
Find, write are irregular verbs.
I got a big stone.
Got is an irregular verb.
We have come across new terms relating to verbs. Verbs denote action. What are verb patterns? Verb patterns are divided into two. The first is a regular verb and the second is an irregular verb. Regular verbs are those verbs that end in a particular patterns, which means the past tense and the past participle end in ed. Past tense refers to an action that has been completed, and past participle is a verb form that is used in tenses. Irregular verbs are those verbs that do not end in a particular pattern. The past tense and the past participle do not end in ed. Whereas for a regular verb, the past tense and the past participle both end in ed. Verb types. Verb types are main verb and auxiliary verb. Main verbs are those verbs that have meaning. Auxiliary verbs are those verbs that helps form a verb phrase. Usually we find an auxiliary verb and a main verb together in a sentence. But sentences can exist with only an auxiliary verb also. Now, auxiliary verbs are divided into two types. The first type is the modal auxiliary verb. These verbs denote possibility, advice, obligation, probability. These verbs denote actions that have not been completed. It's more like when you're expressing the future of an action. Primary auxiliary verbs are those verbs that are used with the main verb, and they are be, have, and do. Let us take a look at the conversations. What do we play? Here, play is a regular verb because the past tense and the past participle both end in ed. The past tense is played. The past participle is also played. Now, do is an irregular verb. It is also a primary auxiliary verb. Why is do an irregular verb? The past tense of verb do is did. The past participle is done. They do not end in ed. I will teach a game. Teach is an irregular verb. The past tense is taught. The past participle is also taught. Here it does not end in ed. Similarly, will is also an irregular verb. The past tense is would. Draw a few squares on the ground. Draw is an irregular verb. The past tense is drew. Past participle is drawn. Write numbers in the square. Find a stone for me. Write and find are irregular verbs. The past tense of the verb write is wrote, and the past tense of find is found. The past participle of the verb write is written, and for find it is found. I got a big stone. Got is an irregular verb. It is already in the past tense form. So the stem form is get, and the past participle is got.
I am new to the game. Hope I can play.
Am, can are irregular verbs. Am is a primary auxiliary verb. Can is a modal auxiliary verb.
Sally, you need to throw the stone to box number 1.
Need is a regular verb and a modal auxiliary verb. Throw is an irregular verb.
Now hop and pick up the stone.
Hop, pick are irregular verbs.
You repeat with the other numbers.
Repeat is a regular verb.
You might miss your chance if you don't get the stone in the box.
Might is an irregular verb and a modal auxiliary verb.
I am new to the game. Hope I can play. Here am is a primary auxiliary verb. The stem form is be. It is also an irregular verb. Hope I can play. Can is a modal auxiliary verb. It denotes an ability. I need you to throw the stone to box number 1. Need is a modal auxiliary verb. And throw is an irregular verb because the past tense is threw, does not end in ed. Hop and pick up the stone. Hop and pick are regular verbs because the past tense of the verb hop is hopped and that of pick is picked. Both of them end in ed and hence they are regular. You repeat with the other numbers. Repeat is a regular verb. The past tense is repeated. Again it ends in ed and hence a regular verb. You might miss your chance if you don't get the stone in the box. Might here is a modal auxiliary verb because it denotes possibility. So now we have almost covered the types of verbs, the verb patterns, and we have learned about the auxiliary verb as well. We have reached the summary of verbs part 1. What are verbs? Verbs belong to open class of words, which means new verbs can be added during the course of time. They denote action. Now we'll be discussing about the verb patterns. They are of the following patterns. First pattern is the regular verb. Regular verbs are those verbs that end in ed, which means the past tense and the past participle end in ed. They follow a particular pattern. For example, if we take an example of the verb talk, the past tense of the verb talk is talked. Here ed has been added to the end. That is, ed has been added to the stem of the verb. Next is irregular verbs. They do not follow any particular pattern. The past tense and the past participle do not end in ed. If we take the example of the verb throw, the past tense is threw. There is no ending of ed, and the past participle also ends in thrown. It does not end in ed. Some examples are Ashley believed in her talent. Here believed is the regular verb because it ends in ed, the past tense ends in ed, and the stem of the verb is believe. The next sentence is the company earned huge profits. Here earned is the regular verb, the stem of the verb is earn. Here again the past tense ends in ed. The next example is the audience laughed at the joke. Here, laughed is a regular verb. Again, the stem of the verb is laugh. it is regular because the past tense ends in ed. Now let's take a few examples of irregular verbs. The movie began right after we reached. Began is the irregular verb and the stem is begin. There is no endings of ed. Paula wrote an apology. Here wrote is an irregular verb and the stem of the verb is write. The last example here is eagles fly at high altitudes. Here fly is an irregular verb and the stem of the verb is fly, and if we take the past tense it is flew. It does not end in ed. Earlier we discussed about the verb patterns. Now we are going to discuss about the different verb types. There are two main types of verbs. The first is the main verbs and the next is the auxiliary verbs. Main verbs are those verbs that carry meaning in a sentence. And auxiliary verbs are those verbs that help the main verb. They help form a verb phrase. To understand better, let us take a few examples of sentences. The turtles are swimming in the sea. Here, are is the auxiliary verb and swimming is the main verb. The auxiliary verb helps to give meaning to the main verb. Next example, this is my idea. Here we have only an auxiliary verb which is, and such sentences can exist without having a main verb. Let's learn more about auxiliary verbs. Auxiliary verbs are of two types. The first one is modal auxiliary verbs. These verbs express possibility, obligation, permission, ability, advice. The next type is the primary auxiliary verbs. They are be, have and do. Be, have and do follow the irregular verb pattern. They do not end in ed. That is the past tense and the past participles do not end in ed. Let us see a few examples. The meeting should have started earlier. Here, should is the modal auxiliary verb because it expresses an advice. The next example is may I leave early. Here it's asking for a permission. Here may is the modal auxiliary verb and leave is the main verb. Next example is he can support his family. Here can is the modal auxiliary verb because it is an example of an ability and support is the main verb. A few more examples. The consumer ought to register a complaint. Here ought is the modal auxiliary verb. Here it is expresses obligation and register is the main verb. You need to listen to your wife. Here need is the modal auxiliary verb because it expresses an advice and listen is the main verb. She might sing. Here might is a modal auxiliary verb because it expresses a possibility and sing is the main verb. Now this place was rebuilt. Was is the primary auxiliary verb and the stem of the verb is be. As we know, be is an irregular verb and the past was does not end in ed. Jess has 8 kittens. Here has is the primary auxiliary verb. The stem of the verb is have. How does the machine work? Here does is the primary auxiliary verb and work is the main verb. Now that we have ended our session, let us take a look at the flowchart. Here we have verb types, which are main verbs and auxiliary verbs. And these main verbs and auxiliary verbs can either be a regular verb or an irregular verb. To make it more clear, auxiliary verbs can either be a regular or an irregular verb. Similarly, main verbs can also be a regular or an irregular verb. Auxiliary verbs are again divided into two types. The first type is the modal auxiliary verb, and the next type is the primary auxiliary verb. Hope that you have understood this session. Please wait for my next session to learn more about main verbs. Thank you for watching. Learn it yourself.